So, shall we pick up our theme again with Richard Baxter? If Richard Baxter was a liturgical calendar, it would always be Lent. While we live in this body, Easter, the glorious resurrection of our earthly raiment, is always and only in prospect. Whatever word captures our current experience, flourishing is not it. Therefore, whoever looks for human flourishing in Baxter's life and writings will have their work cut out for them. Indeed, I think I am reasonably familiar with Baxter, but when I searched through his books for notions of human flourishing, I was taken by surprise. I simply did not expect that it would be so hard to find, or at least so narrowly defined, not just in individual publications, but consistently across his long writing career. So to pick up the first of three books, The Saints' Everlasting Rest, began life as Baxter's funeral sermon. His choice of text was Hebrews 4:9, "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." As he explains early on, this verse presupposes a distance from that rest, a gap that will not be filled while we walk in this world. After death, for those who are found in Christ, this glorious rest will be experienced in all its fullness. For now, even for the best of saints, there is only the unremitting, doleful experience of unrest. In elevating the joyful abundance of that rest to come, the effect is to repress any expectation of deep joy and abundance in our current condition. Thus, the book is predicated on a stark contrast between that perfect future and this imperfect present. Surely happiness is hereafter and not here. That assertion renders the notion of human flourishing problematic, to say the least. And I must admit, I was reassured to hear a couple of people admit that they really didn't have much idea what was meant by human flourishing. It was the same for myself. So here's my go at a definition that sits in my mind. A term something like the Hebrew word shalom, a healing, a health, a fullness, a wholeness of human experience. Though, of course, the Hebrew scriptures make clear that it will be perfectly fulfilled only in the future. Flourishing brings to mind life and abundant growth. I think of a luxuriant plant in its prime, an established healthy tree bearing a profusion of fruit in its season. Flourishing is a communal experience as much as anything. We flourish together, we wither apart. Above all, we wither when we are apart from God, the source of life. So human flourishing necessarily arises out of relationship with God. It overflows with the fullness of his generosity, so that societal or ecological flourishing bring benefit to all regardless of merit. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. Human flourishing is an individual and a communal condition of well-being. It is both physical and spiritual. It is happiness and joy. It is life and health and goodness. Now, that conception is my own, and no doubt it reflects my own time. To the extent that it reflects this secular age and contemporary environmental concerns, it is incomprehensible to the perceptions of those who lived before the industrialization of recent centuries. Human flourishing is not a phrase that Baxter would ever use, but if we look through his writings for proxies that might serve in its place, the results are hardly encouraging. When he tells us that surely happiness is hereafter and not here, it does not bode well. The remainder of the first part of the Saints' Everlasting Rest bears that out, though Baxter concedes that there are foretastes of rest along the way. At the beginning of the book, he defined rest as the most happy estate, to difference it not only from all seeming happiness, which is to be found in the enjoyment of creatures, but also from all those beginnings, foretastes, urns, first fruits, and imperfect degrees, which we have here in this life, while we are but in the way. Yet in the remainder of his sermon, those foretastes are the barest crumbs. If we have some mixed comforts here, they are scarce enough to sweeten our crosses. If we have some short and smiling intermissions, it is scarce time enough to breathe us in and to prepare our tackling for the next storm. Even the things of this world that seem good to us are impediments to that greater good. Oh, the hourly dangers that we poor sinners here below walk in. Every sense is a snare, every member a snare, every creature a snare, every mercy a snare, and every duty a snare to us. We can scarce open our eyes, but we are in danger. It is not that God has made these good things to be a temptation and a trap, but in our corrupted state, that is what they are to us. Indeed, sin is the great culprit. All our senses are the inlets of sin, so that they become the inlets of our sorrow. Grief creeps in at our eyes, at our ears, and almost everywhere. It seizeth upon our head, our hearts, our flesh, our spirits, and what part doth escape it? Fears do devour us and darken our delights, as the frosts do nip the tender buds. Cares do consume us and feed upon our spirits, as the scorching sun doth wither the delicate flowers. So much for luxuriant foliage. There is little of that here. Oh, the dying life that we now live is full of suffering as of days and hours. We are the carcasses that all calamities prey upon. Baxter's presentation of human unflourishing is stark and unrelenting. How much of this can we pin on Augustine? To offer an axiom, Richard Baxter was a Puritan, therefore Augustine must be in here somewhere. The most useful place to start is in Book 1 of De Doctrina Christiana, where Augustine distinguished between frui and uti, between enjoyment and use. Enjoyment involves loving something for its own sake. Use refers whatever object is in view to what it is that one loves. To put it crudely, only God is to be enjoyed, everything else is to be used. Things that are to be enjoyed make us happy. Things which are to be used help us on our way to happiness, providing us, so to say, with crutches and props for reaching the things that will make us happy and enabling us to keep them. Augustine's language sounds worryingly instrumental. Is my neighbour something to be used to enable my own happiness? Is all that consists in this world merely a prop or a crutch for attaining the end of enjoyment in another life? It is not reassuring to hear Augustine substantiate his distinction with the analogy of an exile in a foreign land who is making his way back home. He can be happy only in his homeland, not in his country of exile. It makes no sense for him to love the carriage or ship that is carrying him back home and to be content always to travel and never to arrive. By analogy, such modes of transport are merely what we would have to make use of in order to be able to reach our own country, where we could find true enjoyment. Likewise, in his homilies on the first epistle of John, Augustine warned his hearers, "Don't cling to the way and not arrive at the end. Pass on like a wayfarer." Pilgrims are only refreshed by hostelries. They do not own them, and they certainly do not remain in them. A pilgrim who enjoys the hotel too much to leave is really no pilgrim at all. This world is not the end. If we wish to return to our home country where alone we can be truly happy, we have to use this world, not enjoy it. It is not my purpose here to critique Augustine, let alone rescue him, but it is worth observing that several scholars have argued that his theology is not nearly as instrumental as it might sound, when a Latin word like uti is translated into its best, though clumsy English equivalent, use. Jennifer Hurd, for instance, places the distinction in its original context, Augustine's discussion of relative ends and disordered loves. Of course we can love our neighbour for his or her own sake, as long as our love is properly ordered to God and does not end in our neighbour. In fact, we do not love another person rightly until we love them on account of God and see that person as having been made in the image of God. So Augustine was, to state the obvious, a tremendously rich thinker who was entirely capable of developing an early distinction between frui and uti in ways that do not make this world and the creatures who live in it merely the means to some higher end. Still, one can see the danger. Even if Augustine was capable of warding off the potential implications of his own ideas, that is no guarantee that other, less capable thinkers would be able to do the same in the later centuries of that tradition. This brings us to Edmund Hill's long and quite remarkable footnote, clarifying Augustine's distinction between frui and uti. Megan, you're familiar with that footnote? It's amazing. I've never seen a footnote like it. It's worth tracking down just to read it. So, I mean, most of it is repeating the kind of perspective that Jennifer Hurd offers us, but then he declares that in the hands of persons of narrow intelligence and determined will, it can, and often has, become frighteningly inhuman. It cannot be denied, he concludes, that the whole ethos of puritanical Philistinism, which has so long haunted the European outlook, has descended, as a bastard indeed, but still descended, from Augustine's distinction between frui and uti. Admittedly, it is not entirely clear who he's got in mind, but possibly Richard Baxter might fit. We need to ask, then, if Baxter deployed Augustine's distinction and how well he used it. In other words, when he presented his starkly dichotomous view in The Saint's Everlasting Rest, was he working in the Augustinian tradition? Let us go back for a moment to Baxter's definition of rest. It is the most happy estate, to difference it not only from all seeming happiness, which is to be found in the enjoyment of creatures, but also from all those beginnings, foretastes, urns, first fruits, and imperfect degrees, which we have here in this life, while we are but in the way. Baxter does not employ the distinction between enjoyment and use. He acknowledges the enjoyment of creatures, but between seeming happiness and true happiness. Whatever happiness this world might seem to offer, it is only a fake. Yet what Baxter makes much of is the distinction between ends and means. Augustine spoke rather less about means, even as he prized the end, but Baxter gives a prominent place to both. So, when he first begins to handle the subject of this rest that remains to the people of God, he distinguishes it in order of being. As the bargain remains after the earnest, the performance after the promise, the antitype after the type, and the ultimate end after all the means, so there remains a rest. The governing distinction in Baxter's mind is that between this world and the next, between the means and the end. This has the effect of instrumentalizing the things of this world, something we shall see more clearly as we go on. So even if the distinction he employs is not quite that for which Augustine has been blamed, the effect is much the same. Furthermore, Baxter writes of what we have here in this life while we are but in the way. The language of pilgrimage we see in Augustine is, if anything, even more dominant in Baxter. This world is only transitory and temporal. It is the environment in which God molds his people into who he wants them to be, and that process is far from comfortable. The overwhelming impression in the Saint's Everlasting Rest is of varying degrees of misery and discomfort. Now we are poor, we speak supplications, and our beggar's tone discovers our low condition. All our language almost is complaining and craving, our breath sighing, and our life a labouring. That will change when, and only when, God brings his people into the fullness of rest that he has promised to them. But sure, where all this is turned into eternal praising and rejoicing, the case must needs be altered and all wants supplied and forgotten. It is possible that Baxter's dismal view of this world may be the product of biography as much as anything else. Basically, my hunch is that Baxter's not getting this from Augustine. There are other accounts, other factors, and I think the first of them is the Civil War. I mean, this is his funeral sermon. He felt literally that he was dying. He should have died. It was a disastrous experience. His nose started to bleed. He felt that meant his body had an excess of blood, and so he opened 4 veins, which is, of course, the very worst thing you could possibly do. He nearly died. And then in the midst of his recovery, he writes the Saints' Everlasting Rest. I don't suppose anyone has been in an active war zone. You have? Well, yeah, apart from this person, I don't think we have any idea what Baxter's experience was, the trauma. And my working theory is that Baxter lived his life under the shadow of the Civil War and his experience. It shaped his life profoundly. So I'm not going to read them, but I give you a couple of pages on Baxter's experience of the war, right? And I think it's hard to think of human flourishing in the context of not just a war, but a civil war, which is so destructive, and the English Civil War, which was so very destructive across all of England. And for Baxter, he was so intimately involved in it, uncannily involved, from the very first physical skirmish right through to the last sieges as they were mopped up around the countryside. He saw all this, and then he had his crisis of ill health. And ill health, I think, is also a shaping factor for Baxter. So if we can find it, if we go on a few pages, there is an indented quote, because I have a feeling my page numbers might be different from yours, because mine are New Zealand pages and yours are United States pages, which of course are better. But so I'm on page 10. There's this indented quote that begins, "Hath supported me this 14 years." Can you find that quote? It'll be a few pages on. Sorry to not be more precise for you. I don't want to read that quote, actually. I want to go about 4 lines into the next paragraph, because this is a quote that I think is very moving to me, and suggests where Baxter experience comes from, where he writes movingly of his own bodily condition. If someone's found that, what page are we on? Be on the 8th page. Okay, top of the 8th page. Thank you very much. So he wrote movingly of his own bodily condition that left him utterly weary of relentless ill health, crying in the morning, "Would God it were evening," and in the evening, "Would God it were morning," weary of going, weary of sitting, weary of standing, weary of lying, weary of eating, of speaking, of waking, weary of our very friends, weary of ourselves. Oh, how oft this has been mine own case. No wonder this experience cultivated in him a constant expectation of my change and a contempt of the world. Therefore, Baxter's view of things may have been very Augustinian, but this does not mean that Augustine or even the Augustinian tradition was most responsible for it. Other influences were at work, and in the case of a man as well read as Baxter, other theologians. One thinks of Tertullian, who believed that one thing in this life greatly concerns us, and that is to get quickly out of it. And the scriptures themselves speak of believers as pilgrims in the world, only ever passing through. The book of Hebrews, for instance, encourages its readers with the example of many heroes of the faith who looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. They confess that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. They desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. So it is no easy matter tracing the origins of Baxter's perspective amid his own life experience. His reading of the scriptures and his reading of the truly prodigious range of other authors, Augustine among them. Whatever the case, in the Saints' Everlasting Rest, Baxter offered his readers a stark dichotomy between the present experience of earth and the future experience of heaven. Human flourishing was for then, not for now. That distinction between then and now, with all its implications, is not peculiar to the Saints' Everlasting Rest, written as it was at a moment of unique crisis and trauma. I expected some softening as Baxter moved through the 1650s, and I really did. I thought I sort of expected that I'd go to the Saints' Everlasting Rest and I'd find that kind of gloomy appreciation of life in this world. I really thought that as the 1650s went on, I'd find Baxter's sense of things becoming more optimistic, more positive. And this was the biggest surprise for me, that I didn't find that happening, at least when I went to the next book. This is the one decade of his life that might be described as flourishing. He recovered from his near-death experience. He returned to parish ministry in Kidderminster, where he was very effective, and launched his prodigious writing career with a steady stream of best-selling titles. In 1658, he published The Crucifying of the World by the Cross of Christ. The title alone should be enough to signal that Baxter's view of the life and the body remained unchanged, but the language he employed sounds much more like Augustine. It is almost as if Baxter has encountered De Doctrina Christiana in the meantime, and there's no way of knowing that, but that's a pretty good theory, I think. Somewhere in the intervening decade, he read Augustine and this distinction between enjoyment and use, because we're going to get to a quote very soon in which he employs that distinction. And I think that raises a really important issue. If that's the case, then when Baxter reads Augustine, what does he hear? He's going to fit Augustine into his own frame, his own experience. And that raises the possibility that what he hears Augustine saying is not quite what Augustine intended to convey. Because as he encounters Augustine's categories, he fits them within his own experience that we get indicated in the Saints' Everlasting Rest. That I think is what is going on, but there's no way of proving it. In 1647, the world was in ruins. A decade later, the world was not nearly in ruins enough. It proved all too alluring in the happiness it seemed to offer. Baxter defined the world as the whole inferior creation, or all that is objected to our sense, or as the bait or provision for the flesh, or by the tempter is put in competition with God, both the things and the men of the world. This brief definition is revealing in two ways. First, it incorporates the material and physical, the whole inferior creation, what registers on our senses, both things and people. So the world is not just an intangible system. Second, it casts the world in wholly negative terms. It is bait to the flesh, it is exploited by Satan, it provides for everything that stands in competition to God. Baxter acknowledges that the world as God created it was good, nor can goodness make anything but what is good. But that goodness has been irreparably marred and almost completely obscured by sin. As a result, if we hoped for happiness from the world, we did but hope for nourishment from a stone. Indeed, the world is like wind in your bowels, which can tear and torment you, but cannot nourish you. And without saying too much about Baxter's symptoms, that's one of them. In fact, when it becomes too sweet to our hearts, it is the poison to the soul. Baxter casts the problem in Augustinian terms. Here it is. If the world would know its own place, it might be esteemed and used in its place. But if it will needs pretend to be what it is not, and will promise to do what it cannot, and so would not only be used but enjoyed, we must take it for a deceiver, and rise up against it with the greatest detestation. For else it will be the certain damnation of our souls. For he that has the wrong end is wrong in all the means. The world makes out that it is our home. It promises contentment and satisfaction, but we should not be fooled. As soon as the believer begins to say, "It is good for me to be here," then the world has perniciously deceived you, and if you be not effectually recovered, will be your everlasting ruin. The only solution? Crucifixion. We should treat the world as the world treated Christ. The believer has to put to death her affection, love, and desire for the world, her expectations of goodness and delight. She should see the world as the very filth of the streets that is swept away or cast upon the dunghill, or as a thing devoted to death for the averting of imminent judgment. Crucifying the world, therefore, advocates a militant stance against the world, An enemy it is, an enemy it will be when we have done our best, as long as we are on earth. Therefore, we must be killing it and dying it to the last. We must proclaim war against it, lay siege to it, kill it, or it will kill you. If happiness can serve as a proxy for human flourishing, Baxter offers an extended reflection in ways that once again offer an echo of Augustine. His first point should be no surprise by now. The world is not our happiness. If it were, God would not demand that it be taken out of our hearts. He that made you to be happy doth not grudge you that which should procure it. Going further, the world is an enemy to our happiness, though it pretends otherwise. It is only ever a hindrance in the way to life, and a snare to you continually in all that you do. God alone is our happiness and chief good. Salvation consists in the fruition of our own happiness. And as sure it is that God is not fully enjoyed in this world, much less in the creature, when it is loved for itself and not esteemed as a means to Him. Therefore, salvation necessarily entails the lifelong rejection of the world. And yet, Baxter allows that if the world truly is crucified, it can then, and only then, find its proper place. The believer will use it as it was meant to be used. That which once was venomous may be safely handled when the sting is thus taken out. As stones and earth are useful to tread on, though not useful to feed on, so, though the world be unfit to rest or feed your souls, it may be made a convenient way for you to travel in. It is unmeet to be loved, but it is meet to be used when you have learned to use it. When the world is truly crucified to us, then at last we are capable of seeing God in it. By putting it to death, the world reaches its proper proportions, and there is more of goodness than we first discerned. Potentially, this opens up space for something like human flourishing, as long as the world is kept in its proper place. If we see that anywhere worked out in practice, we see it at Kidderminster, that place which had the chiefest of my labours and yielded me the greatest fruits of comfort. These, that is the 1650s, were the best years of Baxter's life. In the Saints' Everlasting Rest, Baxter had lamented the great difficulty of reformation. How long may we study and labour before one soul is brought clear over to Christ? And when it is done, how soon do the snares of sensuality or error entangle them? But by March 1653, he declared himself to be in the very beginning of a reformation. At first, the number of converts was so small, I was wont to number them as jewels. But that soon changed, and he could hardly keep count. The church added 5 galleries to accommodate the burgeoning Sunday congregation. Our private meetings also were full. On the Lord's days there was no disorder to be seen in the streets, but you might hear 100 families singing psalms and repeating sermons as you passed through the streets. In a word, when I came thither first, there was about 1 family in a street that worshipped God and called on His name, and when I came away there were some streets where there was not past 1 family in the side of a street that did not so, and that did not by professing serious godliness give us hopes of their sincerity. Baxter offered this recollection in 1664. There are earlier hints that the work was a great deal more dogged and less effective than this memory implies, but there is no denying the change that he had wrought in Kidderminster through excellent preaching, backed up by careful, laborious pastoral practice. The parish was transformed, and by the close of the 1650s, the pattern he had established was being followed in other counties. He could be forgiven for thinking that a glorious national reformation lay just around the corner, yet it was not to be. If we want to see Baxter's vision of human flourishing worked out in practice, we need only look back at Kidderminster during the 1650s. But it is human flourishing with a particular scope. If I return for a moment to the definition with which I began, I might call that a horizontal view of human flourishing. It stretches sideways. It looks to society and the environment. It encompasses all those who live together in a particular geography, regardless of their own moral or religious convictions. And I suppose behind that thought is the letter that Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon. where he tells them to seek the welfare of the city. That's sort of in the background of what I'm thinking about in this more horizontal definition of human flourishing. So it is secular in the sense that it is focused on the world and it does not privilege a particular religious view. It is a generalized well-being that is material, physical and tangible, as well as immaterial, spiritual and intangible. Baxter's conception of human flourishing was much more vertical than horizontal. Above all, it focused on God as the ultimate end of all human happiness, towards which all other things and people are only the means. So in a holy commonwealth, in which he offered his thoughts on the subject of good government, and of course, if you know his story, offered those thoughts at the worst possible time, he asserted that the happiness of men and women is comprised in God's everlasting favour, and their nature is fitted to be here ruled by the hopes and fears of the life to come. And without these, the world cannot be ruled according to the nature of man. In other words, when Baxter gives us, if you like, his political theory, even there, this distinction between this life and the life to come is the governing distinction that he'll arrange his ideas around. So the very care and business of this life is to make preparation for another. He defines a commonwealth as a society of God's subjects ordered into the relations of sovereign and subjects for the common good and the pleasing of God, their absolute sovereign. So, that which most advanceth the people to salvation and keeps out sin and keeps out holiness and pleases God is the best government. This is, if you like, a vertical view of human flourishing, one best expressed in practice at Kidderminster. Around 600 people out of around 1,600 inhabitants were active members of Baxter's congregation. It would seem, then, that the majority did not participate in the kind of flourishing he was so concerned to cultivate. They may have gained indirect benefits from living in a reformed parish, but they hardly looked like those who had crucified the world to the cross of Christ. The bleak fact is, though, that even this vertical form of human flourishing was dismantled in the wake of the Reformation. The Restoration. The damage was done in April 1659. Right in the midst of writing the final chapter of A Holy Commonwealth, Baxter received news from London that the army had fatally undermined the rule of Richard Cromwell, the godly ruler in whom Baxter had invested so much of his hope and confidence. So Baxter deplored the killing of the king in 1649. He deeply disliked Oliver Cromwell, who in turn deeply disliked him. But as the 1650s went on, it occurred to Baxter that really this was a congenial environment for reformation. And so I think the regime went up in his estimation. And then when Oliver died and Richard, his son, took his place, and Richard favours the Presbyterians like Baxter, Baxter really is at the height of his optimism about England's future. And it all comes crashing down, and the bad news arrived in April 1659. So the news prompted him to add an extended meditation to his book. He could hardly believe that God, the God of order, the God of love, had allowed Baxter's hopes to be overturned, had made his people as a sea-racked vessel, as the football of contempt. And thus it has been from age to age, and while we glory in the hopes of better days, and thought that charity was reviving in the world, though it cooled when iniquity did abound, new storms arise. Our hopes delude us. We find ourselves in the tempestuous ocean, when even now we thought we had been almost at the shore. It's such a revealing comment. He thought they were almost there. The harbour was in sight. And now a storm has come in and swept them back out into the turbulent ocean, and that harbour has faded entirely from view. I think he had learned his lesson. It is a great mistake to expect perfection of so excellent a thing as holy order here on earth. Or can we be greatlier mistaken than to ascribe to earth the prerogatives of heaven? As the 1650s went on, Baxter had entered into a greater and greater sense of optimism and confidence. And, if that trajectory had allowed to carry on, We might have got a different Baxter, who's just a bit less gloomy about human flourishing in this world. But that's not the trajectory that history gives us at all. And beginning in late April 1659, all his hopes disintegrated. And the effect was to pull him back to something much more like the gloomy realism of the saints' everlasting rest. So, he says this in 1659. He could have said this in 1647. We must sow in tears if we will reap in joy. We must know what sin is before we find what grace is, and what grace is before we find what glory is. If sin were not suffered to show itself in the world and play its part, it would not be sufficiently hated, nor grace or Christ or heaven sufficiently valued. So at Kidderminster, Baxter saw with his own eyes that vertical form of human flourishing he so desired, but it was swept away all too soon. When he left the town in April 1660, he left for good. His restored bishop, George Morley, refused permission for him to preach or to say goodbye. And he was thrust into the experience of nonconformity, ever after to mourn not what might have been, but what he had learned once more was never going to be possible while in this world. If Baxter genuinely believed that this present earthly experience was incapable of yielding human happiness, human flourishing, his 17th century experience did nothing to prove him wrong. So if we are searching for human flourishing in the Augustinian tradition, I'm not sure we can look to Richard Baxter to help us, except in strictly vertical terms. His life experience involved too much in the way of physical and psychological trauma, bitter disappointment, and relentless ill health. More than that, the governing dichotomy between this world and the next encouraged him to place all his hopes in the future and none in the present. For Baxter, this is the wilderness of sin. That is the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. There we flourish. Here we only get by. As he went on to say in his massive Christian directory, written in 1664 and 65, published in 1673, this present life is given us on trial to prepare for the life that shall come after. Sufferings are the ordinary way to heaven. What is that flesh which you so much pamper but a skin full of corruption, a bag of filth, of phlegm or choler or such like excrements? Or, as he put it right back at the beginning in the Saints' Everlasting Rest, mortality is the disgrace of all sublunary delights. It makes our present life of little value, were it not for the reference it hath to God in eternity. And to think that we must shortly lay it down. How can we take delight in anything when we remember how short that delight would be? If there is any vision of human flourishing in reflections like these, it is desiccated, truncated, fiendishly hard to find, and small indeed. All this raises some challenging questions. How much does the scriptural and Christian focus on heaven cause believers to downplay the well-being of this world? Does the Augustinian tradition have the resources to lead us towards genuine human flourishing while in this world? Even if it does, what are we to do with later figures in the tradition, theologians like Richard Baxter, who may deploy the tradition in ways not conducive to the kind of human flourishing we might have in mind? Then again, is my view of human flourishing a complacent one? Maybe I'm enjoying my hotel room just a little bit too much. And in the case of, this hotel room, I'm enjoying that a great deal, though I will go home. But does my critique of Baxter reflect a privileged Western influence and materialism that draw us to settle down in this world and enjoy it, when the experience of human beings for most of our history has been that life is, as Thomas Hobbes so famously put it, nasty, brutish, and short? If Baxter is wrong to labour the hope of heaven as rigorously as he did, he is surely not completely wrong. Even if his views reflect his particular moment in history, he might still speak to ours. It is possible then that he has something to teach us after all.